Thank you so much, Nikki. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to chatting with all of you after the lecture. So, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am traditionally an autism researcher that ultimately kind of fell into this kind of these crosshairs between, neurodivergence and EDS HSD because of my own generalized hypermobility spectrum disorder diagnosis a number of years ago. And then, as I'm sure you imagine, it quickly followed things like MCAS and POTS. Anyways, the longer I talk, I notice I'll probably be getting flushed cheeks. I'm sure you all can appreciate that. Just from that lovely sympathetic hyperstimulation. Anyways, let me go ahead and jump into the meat of the lecture today. I've been invited to talk about this kind of relationship between neurodivergence and hypermobility related conditions. Most of my talk today is going to be kind of reviewing what the current state of the literature, the current state of research. What do we know? What do we still have to find out? What are some promising avenues of research? Those sorts of things. And so hopefully you probably are familiar with some of these research studies if you've taken any time to kind of peruse the literature, but otherwise, hopefully, pulling them all together for you, that will be useful to you. So right now I recently moved and I'm now at St. Louis University. It's my hometown, kind of smack in the Midwest of the US. And I'm assistant professor in the Department of Neurology, and I do mostly research, some teaching. I teach a course that I've built on brain evolution. That's another big area of interest of mine. If you've seen any of my other stuff in terms of some of my genetics work, you've probably seen that I do some other stuff unrelated to EDS and HSD. Although I hope eventually I may be able to come full circle and start, studying that as well from an evolutionary perspective. But still waiting on the genetic data for that. So, especially from that hedge study. So hopefully that'll be made available in the next few years. So anyways, let's go ahead and dive in with that kind of long preamble of mine. So, again, why are we talking about these two spectrum conditions? Obviously, I think as probably a lot of you know, we are recognizing increasingly that there is an overlap between neurodivergence, especially we're talking autism and ADHD, as well as just these very complex physical health differences like EDS. But we also see a lot of other medical issues in autism that, it's kind of this extended phenotype, right? Shall we say. And so we see a lot of gastrointestinal stuff, which obviously has a lot of crossover with EDS, HSD too, autonomic instability, chronic pain, sleep problems for a variety of different reasons, and also a lot of immune related issues. And so kind of smack in the middle of that, we've got Ehlers-Danlos, especially the hypermobile type, as well as the hypermobility spectrum disorders. And I'm going to primarily focus on that kind of spectrum, but I will say that there does seem to be some evidence that we also see some overlap with, with stuff like autism and classic EDS, as well as vascular EDS. We just don't have quite as good numbers, but at least there are some survey studies that suggest that those are, neurodivergence is also occurring in some of the more quote unquote rare forms of EDS as well. Anyways, these are definitely, we're seeing a lot of suggestion of overlap. I think for anybody coming from the zebra community, That is kind of a no-brainer at this point. If you've spent any time living in your own skin and talking with other people who share some of these conditions with you, it's this is a very common topic, which always astounds me that we don't have quite as much research on the overlap, but hopefully we'll slowly get there. So we are seeing an accumulation of different types of studies looking at this association. So we've got stuff like registry-based studies, adult case control studies, pediatric studies, et cetera. And so we are seeing this kind of slowly accumulating body of evidence that is suggesting that, yeah, these two spectrum conditions are definitely overlapping a lot more than we would expect, by random. And I don't know about you guys, but as a patient, from my perspective, and interacting with other people in the community, anytime I meet especially a woman with autism, I am surprised, I'm shocked if she does not have any of these issues. I almost kind of expected as I know, I'm sure it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but it just feels like the co-occurrence is just extremely high, especially with some of these, whether it's looks like pure hypermobile EDS, or maybe some other kind of, a connective tissue phenotype that maybe is not always fitting in an exact modern clinical criteria. But you end up seeing pain association and immune issues and just autonomic issues and gastrointestinal, all this stuff. It just seems to happen a lot. So hopefully over time, we'll continue to get better and better data and better prevalence rates, so that, we have a much better idea of really what the frequency is, the prevalence is of this co-occurrence. And hopefully that's going to lead us further and further down the road to understanding the biology that underlies these conditions when they do co-occur. So probably one of the best ones that's been done to date, and you might well recognize this because this has been around for, I think, about 10 years now. But there was a big study in Sweden. They were looking at their national registries, and so we're talking very large numbers of people that they were able to look at, and they were seeing that, for folks who were diagnosed with EDS, there was a dramatically increased likelihood that they would also be diagnosed with autism. And again, they're just looking through patient records, right? So are these things co-occurring in the same patients? And so these researchers found about almost a 7.5-fold increased likelihood that folks with EDS would also be diagnosed with autism. And then about a 5.5-fold increased likelihood that, again, folks with EDS would be diagnosed with ADHD. They were also seeing, while not quite as high, they were also seeing higher rates of depression as well as suicide attempts. Again, especially for suicide attempts, we definitely need more research in terms of how chronic pain and disability, and also things like poor sleep, really influence vulnerability to these kinds of, risk factors for things like suicidal ideation. This is kind of on my mind currently, just because in the last few weeks, a father of a young lady who is in her 20s with EDS reached out to me and was asking for some advice and some understanding, because his daughter had recently committed suicide back in November. And so this is, there are some studies out there that are looking at chronic pain and disability as influential risk factors in suicide risk ideation and attempts. But we definitely need more research on that, so that, if it's at all possible, if there are things that we can do for folks, in order to alleviate some of that suffering so that they're not in that space. We definitely need to do that. I'm starting to think more about that, and once some of our research, I'm hoping maybe moving in that direction, because I am also working closely with psychiatry here at SLU, and they do a lot of research on suicide. And so I'm hoping we can kind of bring these two things together so we can better understand, and also shine more of a spotlight on how chronic health issues can really influence that, outside of strictly depression, anxiety combinations, which of course do not help. So anyways, I digress a little bit, but I thought that was a good time to talk about talk about that future avenue of research. So anyways, this registry study is one of the strongest ones we have to date. They also looked at siblings of folks who have EDS and also found higher rates of ADHD and depression and suicide. So again, really suggesting that there are some familial factors. Again, no big surprise to any of us who are here currently, right? But it's something that we have to show in the research, in order to support, hey, is this something that, is really genuinely heritable at a variety of levels? And or if there are some shared environmental risk factors as well. So I'm going to come back to this, especially when we talk about some of the immune stuff. I know a lot of us have had, either onset or worsening of chronic disability with things like post-viral syndromes. So again, that's an environmental factor that unfortunately is not uncommon, but is certainly something to be considered. So anyways, this study in general really showing across a wide range of individuals within this country, within Sweden. It's also affecting siblings who don't have the EDS diagnosis, but are also showing these associations with some of these other neurodivergent conditions. Again, this is a big one. This is a strong one. So there's another study that was done just a few years ago, not quite as large as the Swedish study, but this was a relatively large case control study of about 200 autistic folks and then a little over 400 non-autistic people. And so they were looking at the rates of generalized joint hypermobility. So now this, they did look at aspects of whether there was pain and instability and some other connective tissue features so that they could class people as either quote unquote symptomatic versus asymptomatic, because of course there are many people who have generalized joint hypermobility who don't necessarily go on to develop more severe chronic forms of musculoskeletal related disability. But so they were able to kind of divide those individuals. And so they were seeing that there were just, in general, there were higher rates of generalized joint hypermobility in the autistic sample versus the non-autistic folks. And we were seeing that at about maybe almost close to 30% versus about a 10% occurrence rate. And so definitely an increased likelihood for autistic people to have generalized joint hypermobility, regardless of whether they were symptomatic or not. Now, when they looked at the symptomatic folks, and again, this is symptomatic from what I recall from this study. It was defined more loosely, so it's not going to be defined quite as strictly as you might see in the hypermobile EDS criteria or anything like that. But again, they were being a little bit less conservative, trying to get a wider range of individuals that might be kind of in gray areas. And so for those who also had symptomatic generalized joint hypermobility, they were even more likely to fall into the autism group. So again, we're seeing the association definitely with symptomatic generalized joint hypermobility, but perhaps even more interesting to a certain extent, or at least in my mind as a scientist, even just having generalized joint hypermobility that is quote unquote asymptomatic, does seem to be associating with neurodivergence. And so that's really interesting. That gives us some helpful hints in terms of what we might study in future. And so I'll also talk a little bit about one of the studies that I'm working on right now, where we are looking at associations between generalized joint hypermobility of the asymptomatic type, and also autonomic issues, which hasn't really been studied too much in that population. So we can better understand, really how are these phenotypes relating to each other, and do those end up being risk factors in a subset of people who then go on to develop, kind of these full-blown, full clinical conditions. Okay, moving on to orthostatic intolerance. I'm sure a lot of you struggle with this. I know it's probably one of my worst issues, even more than some of the joint pain and instability, which are problematic enough. But this is definitely the one where I have to have accommodations at work in order to be able to do my work. So I have to have like flexibility and what time I have to get to work and things like that. And so I'm sure all of you are probably very familiar with morning POTS symptoms, and those are challenging. So anyways, yeah, so there was a study done a few years ago that was looking at neurodivergence in adults, and also looking at the potential relationship with joint hypermobility, as well as symptoms that are indicative of orthostatic intolerance, which is, of course, the broader category that POTS falls into. And so basically they saw that for neurodivergent adults, if hypermobility was thrown into the mix, that increased the likelihood that those people were going to be reporting symptoms of orthostatic intolerance. So it's not to say that OI was not associating with neurodivergence outside of hypermobility. That certainly does occur. We see a lot of autonomic issues just in association with all types of neurodivergence. But definitely we're seeing it very strongly linking with neurodivergence when hypermobility is in the mix. So hypermobility, regardless of whether it is considered symptomatic or asymptomatic, again, it's a key sign, and should be a good indicator that if it's present in somebody who is neurodivergent, it's not a bad idea to get them checked out for issues relating to orthostatic intolerance too. So anyway, so and this one was good because it wasn't just looking kind of at a kind of simple correlational analysis. It had more of a complex statistical modeling, which probably most of you won't care about. But in anyways, it kind of strengthens the findings, the way that they analyzed it, and so that was very good. The other thing is in that exact same study, they also saw that hypermobility was mediating the relationship between neurodivergence and then also that musculoskeletal pain. So again, we're seeing links with orthostatic intolerance and hypermobility and neurodivergence. We're seeing musculoskeletal pain. And again, that would be more suggestive of symptomatic individuals at that point. And so, this is, hypermobility in general just really seems to be an important and useful phenotype that potentially healthcare professionals could use for somebody who is, maybe newly diagnosed, not seeking out and knowing, hey, I have these hypermobility related issues. Maybe I should also try and, and see a cardiologist or somebody for, for POTS or related issues, or et cetera. So, this is something that hopefully the healthcare realm is going to learn more and more about. In some ways, we may have to actually educate them because, I know clinicians are busy, and I don't know how they are in the UK. I have a suspicion it may be somewhat similar, but here in the US, they are stretched very thin. And I get to see that daily just in some of the departments that I've been with. And so there's a lot of medical PTSD that is you know, that is, I shouldn't say justifiable, that there's a lot of medically induced PTSD, which is based on horrible physician and clinician behavior in some instances, definitely not denying that at all. But at the same time, we've got healthcare professionals that are just being run raw. And under those circumstances, they're not gonna have the spoons, right, to be able to learn all this other information. So hopefully, you know, as our community, as we learn more, we can find better ways to advocate for ourselves. I know that's always a challenge for us, and how to you know, hopefully be able to educate better some of those individuals who are trying to provide healthcare to us. So I know that's not always possible, and sometimes you just got to turn tail and run with some physicians, clinicians. There's a very toxic environment, but you know, if you're lucky enough to find somebody who is you know, somewhat willing to learn, you know, having some of that material available and presented in the right way, you know, can be very useful. So hopefully some of these studies will be informative for us to be able to build those kinds of materials that I know a number of organizations are trying to work towards, which is great. So there was another study actually very recently. I think it's only just hit the quote unquote internet newsstands. And it was looking at the associations between neurodivergence and also chronic pain and chronic fatigue. And so just looking at those, we do, you know, this study did find much more elevated rates of autism and ADHD, or at least self-reported autism and ADHD in association with chronic pain and or chronic fatigue. You know, sometimes to many times the amount to which you would expect to see, like a 14-fold increase in odds in association with autism and the 13-fold increase with ADHD. I should say statistically, don't necessarily take these numbers as multiplicative, right? Don't multiply by 14. That's not quite how that works, but it is a significant increase nevertheless. Again, kind of like one of the other studies that we talked about, they also looked at how joint hypermobility mediated that relationship, which it most definitely did. So, you know, that relationship between either chronic pain and or chronic fatigue and the association with neurodivergence, we're seeing this a lot more in folks who have joint hypermobility. So again, we're just, you know, multiple studies we're seeing this link between neurodivergence and hypermobility, and then some of these other phenotypes like autonomic, musculoskeletal pain, chronic pain of a broader sense, because of course we don't just have musculoskeletal pain, we can have neuropathic pain and all sorts of things, headaches, migraines, stuff like that. And then also chronic fatigue, you know, so which is obviously a very common problem for us. So again, we're just seeing this replicated in different ways across different studies. We're also seeing it in pediatric studies, in studies on children. So there was one a few years ago looking at about 200 kiddos with EDS HSD, and about 16% of them had a diagnosis of ADHD, and about 6% had a diagnosis of autism. So again, in a pediatric population, you would probably kind of expect the rates of that diagnosis to go up by the time they're hitting adulthood, you know, because of course, you know, depending on the autism phenotype, sometimes it's diagnosed really early, especially if there's stuff like language delay and other issues that make it just much more obvious. as well as problematic in school. Kids who have more behavioral challenges in school are much more likely to get a diagnosis. Same thing with ADHD too. They're much more likely to get a diagnosis earlier than the child who is just kind of being quiet and staying to themselves. So, so I would expect, the percentage to increase by the time these kiddos reach adulthood as well, in terms of how many are on the autism spectrum. ADHD was more common in this population, at least in the childhood population, in association with the hypermobile EDS diagnosis versus the HSD diagnosis, although both of them were still nevertheless increased relative to what you would expect for the general population of children at that age. And so also too, they found that EDS kids with HSD also had, probably not surprisingly, more fatigue, more sleep problems, as well as some urinary symptoms. And so again, we're seeing this association between EDS, HSD, hypermobility, neurodivergence, and just kind of multi-system phenotypes. These are affecting a wide range of different organ systems across different people. There was another very recent study in 2025 that was looking more at psychiatric related issues, and in particular looking at things like anxiety and depression, et cetera. And this was also in a pediatric sample. And so and again, this is coming from a clinical sample, so it's always good to keep in mind that it may not be well representative of the EDS HSD child population in general. These are going to be kiddos with EDS HSD that are probably struggling more and coming to these clinics, being brought by their parents to these clinics in order to get help and get treatment. So kind of keep that in mind a little bit, but about 86%, so the vast majority of these kids had at least one psychiatric diagnosis, anxiety being the most common one, or at least what looks like anxiety. I'm sure many of us with POTS can appreciate that anxiety may not always be anxiety, right? Sometimes it can just be a massive adrenaline dump. But anyways, what was labeled as anxiety. But also depression and some other diagnoses were also more prevalent. Now, in terms of the overall, quality of life rating of these kids, anxiety and pain were definitely the strongest predictors of that reduced quality of life, as is probably not surprising to any of us. Sleep problems, a major issue, and they also correlated pretty tightly with anxiety and depression. So if you are not sleeping well, then anxiety is just going to be much more likely and probably vacillating back and forth between anxiety and depression, or sometimes even just exhaustion can look like depression as well. So again, we're seeing this from these childhood, clinical populations. We're seeing these associations with different aspects of neurodivergence, as well as linking up with quality of life issues. And so these, again, they really need, we definitely need a multidisciplinary approach to anyone, regardless of whether, we're coming at it from the autism, ADHD perspective, or from the EDS HSD perspective. We really need to be looking at all of these different potential issues so that hopefully we can help people adjust more easily and get any kind of care that they may need without having to, fight for it or suffer unduly for a really long time. So there was another study a few years ago looking at autism and looking at kind of more broad physical health issues. And so, not just in relation to EDS, HSD, although that was definitely included in the study, but we're seeing in autism associations with, all sorts of gastrointestinal, neurological, endocrine or hormone, rheumatologic, and hematologic conditions. It's just kind of spreading across the gamut. And, so I think we're really coming to appreciate, and this is definitely also coming from within the autism research community. I think they are starting to appreciate that, for folks on the autism spectrum, the likelihood of having other health-related conditions is quite high. These systems are very interconnected, immune system and nervous system and hormones and connective tissue, especially, the hormones and immune and nervous system, they're all cross-talking with each other. And when one kind of gets a little bit out of whack, it's going to potentially affect the others as well. And so you end up seeing these associations oftentimes. And so this is really important, to be aware of, for folks that are on the autism spectrum, on the ADHD spectrum, the likelihood of seeing medical issues, of a wider range earlier, maybe more severe, is quite likely. Now, of course, like I said, they did study EDS. It does appear to be more common, especially amongst autistic females compared to non-autistic females that they were studying in this investigation. And again, we're just seeing this association across different systems of the body. Sometimes it's hard to tell which ones, started it off, right? Which was the domino. And that might well vary for different people. But ultimately, all these systems end up getting involved over enough time. This study also is probably one of the few that really kind of focuses in on autism and EDS and sex. And so, we already know that, at least with EDS HSD or hypermobile EDS HSD, that the people getting diagnosed are predominantly female. And and that occurrence rate is even more exaggerated than the opposite that we see in autism, right? That often we see more males getting diagnosed. Although that is slowly catching up, we are seeing that change a little bit over time, including in the adult range. More women are actually starting to get diagnosed, which is great. So we'll see how that pans out. But yeah, so we do know that, probably some of the associations with this sex skewing of EDS HSD, may well be related to hormones. And it might make connective tissue in women a little bit more vulnerable. That is not to say that men are not affected. They may just be more likely to perhaps be carriers, or to have a phenotype that we are just not as good at identifying, very much like we saw with autism, where the criteria were originally based on males and their behaviors, and that was a very biased way to view autism. And I think we're starting to catch up and recognize that autism, not always, but can often look different in women and girls. And so we may well hopefully see something like that with EDS too. There still may well be a continued sex skewing just in occurrence, but there's probably more males out there that we're missing because they're, not passing the Biden in the right way, and those kinds of things. So as we learn more, hopefully we'll get a better idea of what's actually happening in men too. Are they genuinely carriers, or are they having some kind of phenotype that maybe is not as obvious in the musculoskeletal system, but is apparent in other areas of their body in this multisystemic kind of phenotype. So we'll see. I did a review paper a few years ago, and some of you might have tripped over this at some point if you've ever been kind of trolling the literature. And and in this paper we were talking about the overlap between autism and EDS HSD, as well as how some of these two spectrum conditions can overlap in terms of their phenotypic expression. And so, we kind of reviewed things like the autonomic nervous system, which is definitely affected in both of these spectrum conditions, regardless of whether they're overlapping. We see a lot of immune dysregulation. I think the mast cell stuff is more, it's better recognized in EDS HSD than it is in autism. That is not as popular of a concept, although immune dysregulation, of a more general sense, is in autism. But I think that's slowly changing, especially as we're starting to meld the whole kind of connective tissue literature with the autism literature. So I'm sure that will continue to change over time. And then we also see stuff even like the peripheral neuropathies, which, we kind of classically associate with EDS HSD, right? We're more prone to, to all sorts of small fiber neuropathies, whether or not they're getting diagnosed properly or not. But we do actually see evidence of that in a lot of folks on the autism spectrum, regardless of sex. So it's definitely popping up in males as well. And so when they've actually gone in and and actually done biopsies, they have seen changes to the peripheral nerves and how their structure and likely their function. And so that's something that we definitely see across both of these spectrums. So again, these are, very developmentally active systems. We just see this, this kind of physiological overlap between them. We even see similarities in some aspects of sensory perception, right? There is some recognition that in POTS, especially with a POTS flare, that sensory sensitivity can dramatically increase, especially for vision and audition, but also too, if you've got any, peripheral neuropathy issues, you may also have touch sensitivity as well. But we're seeing a lot of this overlap. And then we're also seeing, again, not only sensory sensitivities, but also, classically, we know that autism often has challenges with proprioception, right, with body awareness. And that, again, that's also something that we really struggle with many times in EDS HSD. Are they from exactly the same reasons? Until we have a better idea of the biological kind of underpinning of these two conditions when they are overlapping, it's a little hard to say, but I would be kind of surprised if there's not a connective tissue phenotype that is influencing that, simply because you are, if your tendons are looser and are going to essentially overstretch beyond what would be the normal range and the safe range of motion. Those stretch sensors in your tendons and in your skin that tell you where your body is and how it's moving, they're not necessarily going to go off until you really reach that extreme angle of flexion. And so we're just kind of, with these connective tissue phenotypes, we're just kind of figuring out when too far is too far only once we've reached it, right? But otherwise, I don't know about you, but I have challenges. If I close my eyes, I have very little idea of where my body is in space, simply because, my peripheral system is really just not most likely sending me those signals. There can be some similar issues with interoception, kind of internal body awareness. That might vary a little bit though, because when you have a lot of these pain syndromes, sometimes that can go the other way and it can be really hard to turn off awareness of certain areas of your body if your nerves are just kind of on fire, right? So we're seeing some overlap, but also some stuff that might be a little bit unique. We do see, again, familial co-occurrence. We're seeing both of these conditions occur in the same families, not always necessarily in the same individuals. So for instance, in some of our studies, we saw, there were a bunch of moms with EDS HSD. Some of them had autism, others did not. And but nevertheless, we still saw they were reporting having autistic kids at a pretty high rate, actually comparable. So let me put it this way: EDS HSD moms who don't themselves appear to have autism had autistic kids at a similar rate as we would see moms who are autistic have autistic kids. So again, there's definitely some probably complex inheritance there, right? It's probably for most families not going to be super simple, like, hey, you have this one gene that mutated and there you go, that's responsible for your whole family's EDS, HSD, and autism and all the other forms of neurodivergence. But it's probably more complicated, in terms of it might be what we would call polygenic, multiple genes, multiple variants that are playing roles together. Again, we've seen it over and over again in autism where like attracts like. So autistic-like people tend to attract autistic-like people and have kids and have autistic or autistic-like kids. And so that is very common, which suggests too that some of the genetic background that is playing roles in those respective versions of autism or autistic-like traits, that you're kind of lumping them all together. And so you may see, in some ways, maybe a bit of an additive effect, but it gets complicated. But in any case, typically what I tell people, on average, the more common a condition is, like EDS HSD, usually the more heterogeneous, the more variable the genetic background is going to be across that whole population, and the more complicated it's going to be. So there may be some people who have a single variant that is really, the major factor. But for most people, it's probably going to be multiple things that are kind of combining and that also may end up playing roles with the environment too. So that's where you may end up seeing some of those issues like, post-viral stuff and, really, really nasty life stressors like, divorce, death in the family. You might see triggers like pregnancy. You might see surgery as a major trigger, all sorts of stuff, really anything that has the potential to kind of touch off an already sensitized immune system. So anyways, that's kind of the general rule. Undoubtedly, there's going to be some folks in the EDS HSD spectrum that are going to have single gene rare variations, so less than 1 in 1,000 people will have them. But probably for the bulk of people, given how common these conditions probably are, the more complex their genetic background is likely going to be. And that's probably why we see it turning up in slightly different ways throughout the family, right? Because these are going to be these little small factors that kind of all add up together, and are going to turn up in a little bit different ways across different people within the same family. So, again, there'll be some people who have a single hit and it's the main thing, and there you go. But most people are probably not going to have that kind of genetic background that is influencing whether they're going to develop EDS HSD or not. So, bit of a tangent, but I thought you might find that information useful. So in terms of shared mechanisms, so this is not an exhaustive list, but I like to generally explain three plausible biological mechanisms as to why we may see these conditions co-occurring, these spectrums co-occurring so much. So one possible mechanism is that there may be one gene that's affected for some people, and that gene happens to affect both the brain, affect brain development, as well as to be expressed, for instance, within fibroblasts that would be producing the connective tissue. And so that's how you could expect to see two organ systems affected at the same time. We see that a lot in a variety of genetic syndromes that have multiple organ system involvement. It's usually like a single gene that's been hit, and you get it across a variety of different tissues. And so this concept is known as pleiotropy, this idea that one gene can ultimately end up affecting multiple phenotypes across multiple organ systems in a single person. So if there's a genetic variation, that targets both of those systems, targets brain and targets fibroblasts that are producing the connective tissue, you may expect to see kind of a paired phenotype in those folks. Now, one example that we've been working on in my lab and in collaboration with some folks at the Mind Institute is that we have reported on finding an EDS-like phenotype in women who have Fragile X premutation. Just in case you're not familiar with Fragile X premutation, this used to be considered kind of a carrier status in parents, especially in moms, of kids who have Fragile X syndrome, which is the most common form of single gene derived intellectual disability. We also see fairly high rates of autism in kiddos with Fragile X syndrome as well. The carriers, they kind of have this intermediate phenotype in some ways, and in other ways, they actually kind of have their own unique phenotype. I'm not going to go into how that may work genetically. It's a little complicated, but if you're ever interested in that, I'm always happy to kind of explain that. I usually like to have a whiteboard and to kind of draw it out because it's good to see what is actually going on. But suffice it to say that we're seeing in a subset of women, an unusually high subset of women with Fragile X premutation who have this EDS HSD phenotype, to the point that, if we didn't already know that they were premutation carriers, they would undoubtedly be receiving the other diagnosis if they went in for, to like a genetics clinic or something. And this is important too, because this is not a gene that is really being looked at on EDS panels. We're hoping eventually, we still have more research to do. This is early days, so I don't want you to necessarily, like call up your geneticist and be like, I want to get this test done right now. It might be hard to get it paid for. If you're willing to pay for it yourself, that's probably fine. If you're just curious, but if you need to get, NHS to approve it or something, that might not go over so well right now because it's still kind of early in terms of the research. But anyways, we see this FMR1 mutation. It definitely is expressed in developing neurons. It affects brain development. So we do see higher rates of autism and ADHD and anxiety and some other issues, some learning disorders and things like that in people who have the premutation. But we also see that it's probably affecting how the fibroblasts are functioning. And that's most likely leading to some of the hypermobility issues that we see in these folks. I'm not going to get into it, but probably some aspects of how this mutation works are probably leading to higher rates of not just hypermobility, but the actual disability with the chronic musculoskeletal pain and instability and stuff like that. So we're continuing to work on this. It's kind of been a slow process, but we'll get there in the end. And kind of our next step is we're hoping to get an idea of prevalence of the premutation in samples of folks with EDS HSD to see how common it may or may not be. So we'll see. Hopefully over the next few years we'll get there and we'll be able to, I'm hoping, recommend it as an addition to EDS genomics panels. So okay, so that pleiotropy is one mechanism where you may see single gene variation affecting multiple organs. Okay, that's one option. Another possibility with these connective tissue disorders is that connective tissue is not relegated out in the body to the musculoskeletal system. There are also parts of the extracellular matrix. This is kind of the more fancier name that we give to things like collagen and some other proteins that all make up this connective tissue. There are ECM components that are present in the brain. For the most part, the fibrillar collagens, which are the ones we tend to think of when we think of like our tendons and our skin, those are kind of limited in the brain. We see a few places where they exist, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of them. But we do definitely see other ECM proteins, other types of connective tissue, like things known as laminins and tenasins might sound familiar, fibronectin and integrins. These are all play really integral roles in brain development and day-to-day functioning. We see them affect neuron production and then how those neurons migrate in early development. And then also then in the adult brain, that connective tissue is really important for kind of mediating the interaction between the brain tissue and the vasculature, so that ideally this very, metabolically greedy organ known as the brain can, of course, function properly and get appropriate oxygen and other nutrients from the blood. And then it's also in certain areas surrounding the synapse. So we have something known as a paraneuronal net, which is kind of this big net that kind of engulfs these synaptic regions where cells are communicating with each other. So these are all very, very important ECM proteins, different aspects of connective tissue that we also see out in the body as well. They're not relegated to brain. So there is the possibility that while this may not be strictly a collagen-related issue, there may be other parts of the extracellular matrix network that could be affected that could also lead to some of the hypermobility, but also may be expressed in brain and could be influencing brain development and daily functioning. So that's another possibility there. And then the last one that I usually like to suggest, simply because we do see so many immune-related issues in these two populations, as well as in their families, especially, we see a lot in moms, a lot of immune dysregulation. This is another potential pathway to targeting both brain development and day-to-day functioning, as well as connective tissue development, as well as maintenance and turnover of that connective tissue. And so, we see, if there are any immune disorders, immune dysregulation, that can definitely potentially affect brain development. That could be coming from the embryo or fetus directly. That also could be something that's shared between mom and the fetus. There are some immune molecules that are able to cross the placental barrier and also the blood-brain barrier. And they are, even though we tend to think of them as strictly immune molecules, many of these do play roles in brain development. They are a normal part of brain development, but obviously they tend to be tightly regulated in terms of how much are available. And so if you have too much maybe of a particular immune molecule that has made it into the developing brain, you could definitely alter how neurons are developing, how they're migrating, and then ultimately how they connect up to each other. And so, again, we may see, especially in families, I don't know about you guys, but my family is just rife with immune issues. And we have a lot of autism and ADHD and just neurodivergence of all types. And this is a very common theme in my family, at least. And so that's potentially a big factor as well in neurodevelopment. I know from the neurodiversity community, we don't always think of that because it almost sounds more like an environmental issue, and it can be, but at the same time, there are definitely aspects of how the immune system functions that are laid down in the genetics as well. And so while, it could be a genetic propensity, it could be an indirect effect. It could be the immune system influencing how the brain develops, and that ultimately increasing the likelihood that that person might end up being neurodivergent. So it doesn't always have to be coming from within the developmental machinery of the nervous system itself. Sometimes it can be another system within the body, like the immune system, like the endocrine system, the hormones, right? All these guys get into the not all of them, but some of them can get into the developing brain. They can be shared back and forth. So there can be an intergenerational kind of effect between mom and developing infant that again is shared multi-generationally. So when we think about heritability, it's important not always to assume it's a simple kind of, all right, this gene affects this, this area of the brain and how these neurons are developing. And that's exactly how, we basically get neurodivergence in this family. And that can definitely happen, but it could be something more indirect that is still nevertheless present in the genome. So that's something that's kind of a concept to think about. It can be more complicated, even though it can still be heritable. Just kind of like to throw that out there. I personally find that kind of stuff fascinating because I love biology and I think it's awesome. It's also one of those ways how we have evolved to be able to developmentally respond and have a certain amount of plasticity relative to the environment, that we can kind of have this kind of immune system and hormone system interface between mom and the developing infant, so that that can actually predispose towards certain phenotypes that may ultimately be useful in the face of whatever, typically the body is assuming that that there's some kind of infection, right? That it's some kind of outside factor or parasitic or whatever, right? The brain doesn't know why the immune molecules, why it's getting bathed with these immune molecules or these hormones, right? All it knows is, okay, we've got these plastic systems. I need to kind of develop in this direction instead, because we're receiving these, these influences from mom, from the outside environment, right? And so they're not going to know the difference between whether mom has an immune disorder versus mom has a nasty infection. And so part of it will influence brain development, but also a big part of it is in order to kind of train the infant's immune system and hormones in order to be prepared for that outside insult, right? So it's kind of one of those things where we've developed this evolutionarily. And it's really great for these infectious things. But if mom has an immune disorder, maybe that's not always so good. I don't know about you guys. I could probably do without an immune disorder. But hey, I guess, I like the way my brain works. So I guess you got to lump it, right? So, anyways, so those are kind of the major three. We've got this pleiotropy, this genetic pleiotropy, this kind of shared effect across different organ systems. We have the possibility for connective tissue effects in the brain during development and then day-to-day functioning. And then finally, immune system can also affect brain development as well as connective tissue development, right? Inflammation will chronically tell the connective tissue to break down. And your body's going to produce a bunch of these, essentially what I like to call molecular scissors that are going to come and clip stuff. And you're going to have this very rapid turnover of these extracellular matrix proteins in these circumstances of inflammation. Normally, if you have an acute injury, that's a good thing, right? You want to come in, you want to clip all that stuff off, you want to repair, you want to, repair that area where the injury has occurred and then move out. Okay, acute, that works great. That's what it was designed for. But for these chronic vulnerabilities, you just end up having this nasty turnover of extracellular matrix proteins, which is probably weakening the connective tissue long term as well as creating probably some of the nerve issues and the pain issues and all that kind of stuff. So, not originally what it was designed for, but it is what it is, right? A little bit more on some of the immune link with hypermobile EDS. There was a study a number of years ago by I think it was an Italian team that they basically took fibroblasts from folks with a few different types of EDS. They had folks with vascular EDS, classic EDS, and then the hypermobile form. And so they definitely, when they were looking at how these they'd use these guys and they produce them and get them to grow in petri dishes, right? And so they look at each participant's sample. And so folks with vascular EDS, they definitely had very abnormal connective tissue remodeling, as is probably not super duper surprising. With classic EDS, there was changes in the turnover of the connective tissue. Again, you got to replace this stuff every once in a while. It's not a state of permanence. But then in the hypermobile EDS folks, they saw definitely some kind of strange disorganization within the connective tissue. So definitely something was going on. But what they actually saw was that these fibroblasts were activated into what's called a myofibroblast. And so normally, like if everything's going along and things are hunky-dory and there's no tissue injury, the fibroblasts are just kind of chill and they're doing their normal thing. Once there is a tissue injury or some kind of stimulus that indicates a tissue injury, the fibroblasts in that area are going to switch into a myofibroblast-like state. They're going to be, producing extracellular matrix proteins, but then they're also going to be producing stuff that's going to help to chop up the existing extracellular matrix. Ultimately, this is basically to break down and then repair the tissue, right? And so that's what they're seeing. That's what these scientists saw in the petri dishes of people who had hypermobile EDS. So again, we're seeing this link between the immune system, inflammation, and this kind of myofibroblast-like state. Which I don't know about you, but I feel is very, very telling and kind of sums up my life in a nutshell. I feel like I'm just one big myofibroblast some days. That's what it feels like. Now, I will also say in one of our earlier survey studies, we did a very large survey study of over like 700 people. And I think it was like 400 some odd reported having EDS HSD. And when we looked at folks who had kids, they reported having kids. And so EDS HSD moms who reported having more immune symptoms were much more likely, they were significantly more likely to report also having autistic kids. Compared to the EDS HSD moms who reported fewer immune symptoms. And so again, kind of like we were talking about those links with the immune system, but then also possibly some of that intergenerational links. Again, inheritance is not always a simple one-to-one, this gene does this in this organ, and there you go. Sometimes it can be much more indirect. Sometimes it can be parent to child. It can vary significantly. So, but again, I find that kind of stuff fascinating. All right. So, all this stuff together, it's really important, I think, for clinicians to start recognizing these overlaps. Definitely when we are working, with folks who are neurodivergent, it would be a really great idea to screen for stuff like joint hypermobility, including the musculoskeletal pain, dysautonomia, especially the orthostatic intolerance type, but other types as well. And also just chronic pain, especially given the implications of all of these things in terms of quality of life. That's like the biggest thing, right? And then when we are working with EDS HSD populations, again, it's a really great idea to screen for different neurodivergent phenotypes. And just because we are seeing those, or we're seeing these so frequently co-occur, this is and it's problematic, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, right? That, the longer it takes to get diagnosis, the longer that kind of extends out those impairments in quality of life. The sooner that we can, have a better idea of what's going on, what are the different, phenotypes that we have. Many times you might be the one to recognize it well before a physician does, and you may have to end up seeking out diagnosis. That is very common. Sometimes across multiple diagnosticians. Again, that is also very common because these are spectrum conditions and they're very nuanced. And unless you're working with a clinician who is really experienced and has a lot of real world experience seeing a wide range of these different spectrum conditions, it can be really hard for a less experienced clinician to actually recognize the signs. Sometimes they can be soft, sometimes they can be subtle. So, that's challenging. And I'm sure that is even more challenging in an NHS system, of course, where you're limited to regions. And that really sucks. If it makes you guys feel any better, it's getting worse in the US, where we really don't have a lot of choice either nowadays. We're not as regionally located, but now our insurance companies just refuse to pay for everything. So it's kind of the same end result, unfortunately. So, and of course, people, I really consider, spectrum folks like us to be the canary in the coal mine for healthcare quality, because we are the ones that are complicated and have high needs and are going to fall through the cracks the easiest, unfortunately. So that's why I always like to say the more, the more zebras, the more autistic folks, the more neurodivergent folks we can get into these areas of healthcare and science, the better. At the end of the day, it's almost like we just kind of have to fix the issue ourselves because we're already kind of doing it, right? We are having to be our own advocates. We're having to often be our own physicians. We have to figure everything out before we even go to the physician to know what to ask for. And that's not that's something that we have often had to do. I think in modern day healthcare, that is becoming more predominant for a lot of people, not just our communities. So, but I think at the end of the day, we got to try and fix some of it ourselves because we're the ones that are going to know how it probably best needs to be fixed anyways. So at least that's one little person's opinion here. So, anyways, so as far as all the studies that I've reviewed, there are definitely many limitations. There's still a lot to be desired in terms of, the research. There's still a lot to do. Some of the challenges are that a lot of these are relying on self-reported measures. And while I definitely firmly believe that self-report and survey studies and things like that have an incredibly valuable place, especially when a lot of zebras can't necessarily get in to do a study, either for travel or just general ill health. That offers a way for us to take part when we might not be able to otherwise. But when it comes to scientific rigor, it's really ideally if we can get participants in, do the assessments, kind of all these different assessments and look at how are they really associating with each other. That gives so much clearer data because it allows us, to be able to address some of the questions that we may have had. I am firmly a believer in lumping. I really personally do not see a clear difference between hypermobile EDS and then the HSD spectrum, especially as they're occurring in the same families. And you know, and some of the newer data that's coming out, you know, talking about some of the fibronectin biomarker that is, you know, seems to be consistent across that entire spectrum. And so, you know, but at the same time, we have a scientific history in recent years of changing our definitions of diagnosis, which really complicates when we're trying to do like anything retrospective and looking through charts and stuff. So, you know, it's one of those things we need those kinds of studies as well so that we can address those big question marks whenever some of those annoying people raise them, right? Who are the, you know, the folks who do feel like HEDS is different from the hypermobility spectrum. And there are definitely those out there. So we need to do the studies to be able to address those factors too. And either, you know, say, hey, 100%, nope, this is really genuinely a spectrum, at least as far as phenotype and some of the biomarkers that we're seeing and how it's occurring in families. Versus, oh, actually, no, maybe there's some aspects of hypermobile EDS that are a little bit more unique and compared to HSD. So at the end of the day, I just want to remind everybody, though, that we are going to find, you know, each family from a genetics perspective and an etiological perspective is probably going to be a bit different. We see that with autism, right? It's all kind of one spectrum of many different varying degrees and overlapping, you know, Venn diagrams and stuff like that. But each family kind of has their own brand, and sometimes individuals even within the family have a bit of their own brand. But I expect to see something similar with EDS HSD. So I'm not super hung up on, collecting everybody together into these exact homogenized groups because I don't think that's possible. So I do tend to look at it a little bit more like autism. And again, I'm originally coming from an autism research perspective and seeing how in that realm we've already dealt with those kinds, that kind of heterogeneity. And again, it's undoubtedly a variety of different genetic factors and maybe some environmental factors that are all funneling through and kind of collapsing on, kind of some similar phenotypes that are overlapping. So the root cause is probably going to be a bit different for folks across different families. But then ultimately, many of the symptoms are going to kind of overlap, you know, and so that's what I expect ultimately to see. So we'll see how that goes in future. On that note, talking about genetic markers for hypermobile EDS, I don't have ridiculously high hopes for the Hedge study coming out that was doing the whole genome sequencing. I'm sure they found some stuff that's kind of inevitable, but if autism has taught me anything, there's probably going to be a small subset of folks with rare variants that seem to probably be responsible largely for their phenotypes, but the rest of the group, it's going to be kind of a question mark because it's going to be most likely much more complicated. And most genetic studies don't really approach it from that perspective. It takes some more complex forms of analysis to even start to get at some of these, what we would call these weaker variants that may be playing measurable roles, but are really hard to figure out because they may not be completely absent in people who don't have EDS. So that's when it gets more complicated. When there are variants that are occurring, that are rare but occurring in a subset of EDS, but hardly any people without EDS, that's really easy to find. That is low-hanging fruit as far as genetic studies are concerned. But that's probably not going to be the majority of people's genetic background. If autism is any indicator, and I suspect it probably is. So the biological link between these spectrums, I think we're slowly getting there. We've got some good ideas as to what could be going on, but we don't have anything confirmed. And again, it might vary. It's probably going to vary by individuals. We, again, may see similarities in families, but then differences across families. But I will say that, all this research that I talked about today, kind of the state of it, for the most part, it's in a pretty decent agreement, which is great. Individually, certain studies might be a little bit weak if you look at them as singletons, but when you kind of pull everything together, we're seeing a relative consistency. The prevalence rates, the how many fold times one thing is enriched in another, that's going to vary. And that's all going to vary based probably on the populations that they're sampling, how they decided to get people into their study, how they recruited, whether people are reporting diagnoses, whether you're testing a broader autism phenotype versus, no, this person definitely has a diagnosis of autism and we can see it in their chart. So there's going to be variability there, but overall, there seems to be some fairly consistent agreement, which is great. But yeah, we do need to, keep going down that avenue and, designing better and better studies that are really going to get at some of these questions, some of the weak points, some of the criticisms that are brought up by naysayers, things like that. So, but we've got some good stuff to start out with at least. So, like I said, we're seeing this overlap. Probably number of biological pathways that are responsible for these kind of multi-system organ differences. But they're all probably going to be funneling through some common some common phenotypes, some common structures, biological structures. So and so it would be a good idea to look at longitudinal developmental trajectories for folks following kids on through to adulthood, following hypermobile folks through adulthood. I don't know about you guys and your phenotype. My phenotype was definitely hypermobile as a kid, but I did not experience pain. I really didn't start to have any kind of chronic musculoskeletal disability probably until my mid to late 20s. So it was, that was not an early symptom for me personally. And probably my first, connective tissue symptom, what was an annular tear in my spinal column, which is still giving me problems. But because I was an idiot and I decided to lean over working on a project for like 8 hours overnight, and it just tore. And which would not normally happen in a 23-year-old, but I didn't know that I had a connective tissue disorder. So wish I knew before that. I wouldn't have done that. My back would be a little bit more okay. But yeah, I had more hormone issues earlier on, and I have PCOS, and that was probably one of the earlier things, and the annular tear. But then that was like my early 20s. But then I really didn't start to have a lot of mast cell stuff and joint pain until, probably I was like 26 or 27. And then it just kind of swept in from there. And, and I'm not sure if I had POTS, honestly, because I was not looking at my heart rate for most of those years, probably until I got the Apple Watch and can kind of keep an eye on that. So it's one of those things I think I might have felt fatigued, but it wasn't obvious to me, right? It was just one of those things that I lived with because I was, stupid and a kid, right? So you don't really think about that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that was my personal trajectory, and it's just gotten worse and worse as perimenopause has come on and hormones have just done funkier and funkier things. So, but then I know there's some folks who have phenotypes where they do have significant musculoskeletal pain and disability when they're children, and folks who are having multiple surgeries by the time they're in adolescence and things like that. That wasn't my phenotype, and I would like to know more about this range that we see in our spectrum, and to understand what similarities do we have, maybe what differences do we have in some of these kind of different expression patterns. So anyways, kind of wrapping up here, a little bit about my lab's work, just in case you're kind of interested. I talked a little bit about the Fragile X premutation stuff. We're continuing to work on that. And our next goal is, we want to look at prevalence rates of the premutation in folks with EDS HSD. We're hoping possibly to do that with the All of Us database, but we're trying to work out whether that's going to be possible, because the genotyping for that, for the sequencing for that particular variant is challenging. It's not a simple nucleotide variant. Unfortunately, it's actually kind of an accordion expansion of repeats, and that makes it complicated. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to do that with that database. I'm hoping to see if we can tweak it and possibly work it, but if not, we're going to be looking for other possible databases that we could use that maybe have more appropriate sequencing to try and answer that question. Because we do see that, the premutation occurs in about 1 in 200 women, which is quite common. And then about 1 in 400 men. As you can probably guess by the prevalence and the differences between the sexes, it is on the X chromosome. And so it's just less common in men because they only get one. So, but we do see an association with the premutation with Fragile X associated tremor and ataxia syndrome, or FXTAS, which is a type of neurodegenerative disease. It's a little bit more common in the men than in the women because, again, they only have one copy of it. So they're a little bit more vulnerable. But we also see it associated with Fragile X associated premature ovarian insufficiency called FAXPOI. This is the most common form of really early menopause. This is the most common cause of really early menopause. So we're talking before the age of 40. So I will say also too, if you've had menopause before the age of 40, and not simply because they took your uterus and your ovaries out, but it just kind of naturally happened, it's not a bad idea to get tested for this, because this is the most common cause of it, the premutation. And so now we're also potentially seeing this EDS HSD phenotype. And so hoping, I like looking at EDS HSD through this lens because we already know the genetics behind it, which makes it a little bit easier. So there's fewer blanks to fill in, and we can possibly develop a better understanding of one of the mechanisms of EDS HSD that could possibly be applicable to other subsets. So we'll see how that goes. This has just been a slow series of studies, but we'll get there in the end. One of the other things that I'm studying is I'm looking at orthostatic challenges, kind of subclinical orthostatic features in people with asymptomatic generalized joint hypermobility. And just to say, in our preliminary studies, we are seeing links between that. And so we're trying to collect more participants. We did a preliminary study on college-age women. And so now we're trying to do still college age, but expand that across the sexes and also get much larger numbers to address whether that's going to be replicated or not. But yeah, generalized joint hypermobility, that affects a substantial portion of the population, of the general population. So we're looking at anywhere between 10 and 25% of the population. And so if we do see, regardless of whether they're symptomatic or not, if we do see associations with orthostatic issues, again, that could be suggestive that even those folks are having maybe some blood pooling that is affecting their autonomic nervous system and maybe making them more vulnerable to a variety of other health conditions. So again, this is very early, so take this all with a big grain of salt. We're going to continue working on this, and hopefully it'll turn out the way I think it does based on the preliminary data. But as always, you got to wait until you get there. So, so kind of keep an eye out for that. It'll probably take a couple years. And then I also do some non-EDS related work. I do a lot of computational work, a lot of bioinformatics, and I work a lot with clinical paleogenomics. So if you've heard of any of our work on associations between a subset of Neanderthal DNA and autism, that was my lab. And then also studying how many autism related genes evolved in the first place, because I'm big on evolutionary context, telling you a lot about what they're doing and what they're supposed to be doing today. Still. So, and then I also do evolutionary genomics as well, unassociated with anything clinical. So, anyways, that's the end of it. I went longer than I thought I did, so that's good, but not over. So that's great.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Casanova. That was absolutely fascinating. Yeah, you can see from the comments in the chat. I mean, it's just fantastic. So
Yeah, it's
thank you
at
so
99
much.
plus, so I think it stopped. It stopped counting at that rate.
But no, I mean, obviously, absolutely ran over time. So there isn't any time for questions. But as I put in the chat, no one we just were fascinated listening to you. What I will say is, would you be willing to share your slides with me so that I could
Oh yeah,
send them?
yeah, yeah. I
That
can
would be
send them to you.
amazing.
I'll put them in a PDF and
Oh,
you can.
fantastic. Thank you so much. And then I can send those out. And the last, will you come back in a year to talk to us more
Oh
about your
yeah, yeah.
research?
Hopefully, some of the Fragile X stuff is finally getting published by that point. We had a case studies that got published, but there's one that's just kind of been hung up in review for a while and it's driving me a little crazy. So I hope that will be available by that point too. And then we'll also have more data for that, the autonomic hypermobility
Yeah,
study. And be able to start saying, are we seeing the same patterns that we saw in the smaller sample? So.
lovely. Well, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much. As they're saying, wonderful webinar, full of information, lots of big words, but hopefully we
Got there in the end.
you
Hopefully, yeah.
got there in the end. It was absolutely amazing. So I just wanted to say thank you again so much.
Sure.
Have a good afternoon, your time,
Yeah. Yeah. And
and
good
to
evening to
everybody
you
else
all.
watching, have a
Yeah.
good evening.
Yeah.
Thank you,
And
everyone.
and feel free, if anybody wants to email me, feel free to screenshot, and you can reach out to me. The only thing I ask is I'm getting very overwhelmed with a lot of stuff, and so I love talking with our community and staying in contact. But if I don't respond, feel free to politely nudge me again, because only so many spoons, right? And I to the best of my abilities, I try to respond, but stuff slips through sometimes. So
Yeah.
apologies in advance if that happens. You're always welcome. I'm friendly, I don't bite. You're always welcome to approach me and nudge me again. So